Welcome to Worldly Wise, the Federal's video show, where we discuss global developments, deconstruct complex issues that make news, and occasionally talk to diplomats, academics, and anyone else specializing in international issues. Today, we look at the Russia-Ukraine war as it completes 2 years. Russia invaded Ukraine exactly 2 years ago on this day. The special military operation, as Russia calls it, was expected to finish quickly. However, it shows no signs of ending. Over time, the world has got used to the conflict and probably even bored. It has moved from news headlines into small print, from dramatic images on television news to brief mentions. The coverage may have diminished, but that in no way reflects the actual fighting on the ground. Large parts of Ukraine's north, east, and south lie in ruins. Towns and cities have all but been abandoned. Villages are deserted. The intensity of the fighting may ebb and rise, but it is on, very much on, mind you. Ukraine does not officially publicize the number of deaths of armed personnel in the conflict. Western news reports estimate it at around 70,000. Around 120,000 troops have been injured. The New York Times, for instance, the New York Times report, for example, estimates Russian troop casualties at around 300,000. The reason for this higher figure for Russian casualties is because there are around 13 lakh Russian troops which are in action. In comparison, Ukraine's troop strength is around 500,000. So obviously the casualties will be much less. Of course, it is to be expected also that the Western media will give a higher figure for enemy casualties while playing down its own allies. So that should be taken with a pinch of salt, this particular data. Now, if you take an independent agency like the UN Monitoring Group, they estimate civilian casualties in Ukraine to have crossed 30,000 in the 2 years of conflict. And out of these, 10,000 have been killed, which means the remaining 20,000 are seriously hurt, injured, whatever. Millions of ordinary Ukrainians have been displaced. Thousands have lost their homes. Hundreds of medical and educational institutions have been simply destroyed, says the UN Monitoring Group. So it's not just the casualties, the effect of the war is extremely large. And fighting is fierce, even if it is sporadic. Unlike the fighting in an earlier phase, when it was continuous, Russia has not hesitated to use advanced hypersonic, ballistic, and cruise missiles. Ukraine, with help from its backers, including the US and its allies in Europe, has managed to retaliate, and pretty well. But this has not proved to be a lasting setback for Russia, which has returned each time with heavier fire. After all, we are talking of Russia, which is vying for the top job, along with the US. Putin, dealing with widespread US-led sanctions, is having his share of headaches. The military needs troops, and there is a general unwillingness among Russians to join the army in its war against Ukraine. Well, it's not a surprise because, after all, Russia and Ukraine were once friendly neighboring provinces in erstwhile Soviet Union. Many have friends, relatives, and family connections with one another. Putin has been subject to periodic setbacks, like the Wagner mutiny, that almost got the president. Russians have showed open opposition to the war by sporadic protests and unwillingness to join the army. Many simply don't identify with the war. Thousands have attempted to flee Russia to avoid conscription. So it is an unpopular war in Russia, with Putin barely managing to control the narrative. Any war or wars, they take a huge toll on a nation's economy, infrastructure, and morale. It is the last resort when all other avenues fail. Does the reason for the Russia-Ukraine conflict stand up to scrutiny? The immediate trigger was Ukraine's possible membership of the Western military grouping NATO, the trigger for the current war that is going on. And this comes when there was already an undercurrent of tension between Ukraine and Russia since 2014, following the civil unrest in Kiev that saw the overthrow of the pro-Moscow president Viktor Yanukovych. After this came Russia's annexation of Ukraine's strategically important port of Crimea. Using covert methods and separatists in Ukraine, Russia captured parts of the Donbas region bordering the two countries. This I'm talking about in 2014. A series of ceasefire deals were signed between the two nations, but none really worked. Low-intensity conflict continued in those Donbas, and it continued till 2022, when Ukraine's President Zelensky declared his country's intention to join the Western military grouping NATO. Well, this set the cat among the pigeons, so to speak. Russia warned Ukraine against joining NATO, as this would mean its historical enemies, the US and Western Europe, would set up base across its border. You may recall that Putin was a KGB officer when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and he knew fully well the active role played by Western intelligence to break up the erstwhile superpower. He was insecure and indicated as much. He minced no words on this count. But the West ignored him totally, and they egged Ukraine on. Its president, a former comedian, Zelensky, underestimated Putin's mood. A novice in politics, he had no previous experience in politics until he campaigned and became a president. Zelensky did not take him seriously and allowed the West to raise the pitch. Putin reacted violently and mounted an invasion against Ukraine on Feb 24, 2022, exactly 2 years back. Now, Ukraine least expected it, and so did its Western backers. There were peace talks in the initial days, and it looked like some kind of an agreement would be hammered. Unfortunately, Zelensky, puffed up by Western advisors, who also promised military support, went cold on negotiations. Since then, the world has witnessed a horrifying conflict. Ukraine, one of the top productive provinces in erstwhile Soviet Union, has ended up seeing a large part of its industrial infrastructure destroyed, its high wheat-producing fields laid to waste, its nuclear facilities under Russian siege. Worse, it has lost sizable swathes of land in 4 provinces in the east, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Now, the question is the issue of joining NATO so important for Ukraine that it required to provoke Russia and then carry on fighting even at such a huge cost? In most cases, wars get triggered when one country encroaches on another's territory or one preempts a possible attack by another. But neither of this happened immediately preceding the current conflict. In 2014, Russia had moved aggressively against Ukraine and annexed some territory, including Crimea. But that was over and done with. And like I said before, it was just in the background. It was not there overtly. A more astute politician in Ukraine would have probably judged the situation better and put off joining NATO for another day. I mean, more importantly, they would have conveyed this to Putin. It might look as if Ukraine bowed to Putin's threat, but in real politics, it is eminently acceptable for a nation to move back tactically when the situation demands it. Even after Putin attacked Ukraine, Zelensky could have negotiated a quick end to the fighting. Joining NATO is not a matter of urgency for Ukraine. It could even have waited for several years to go ahead with its plans. All Zelensky had to do was look back, take a leaf out of the US-Soviet Cold War. There, after nearly 5 decades of an incessant but low-degree conflict, the West succeeded in helping breaking up the Soviet Union, almost peacefully, with the least bloodshed. Unfortunately, neither Zelensky nor any of the Western leaders, including the US President Joe Biden, was able to clearly read the situation. And for that, Ukraine and its people have had to pay a devastating price. Clearly, after 2 years of war, the situation has got into a more complex tangle, and it looks like a lot more effort is required for the conflict to end, save for unexpected developments. The latest is that the United States is getting a trifle tired with the conflict and has indicated that it would wind down its backing of Ukraine. Mind you, it's a very big step. And this is not good news for Ukraine.
ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಸುದ್ದಿ ಅಪ್ಡೇಟ್ಗೆ ಈಗಲೇ ದ ಫೆಡರಲ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಯೂಟ್ಯೂಬ್ ಪೇಜ್ ಅನ್ನು ಸಬ್ಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಮಾಡಿ.